Hi, my name is Christoph Lürich. I'm a professor at the University of Applied Science in Trier. And I would like to talk about design concepts of serious games for learning. My motivation for this is twofold. One is I would like to summarize and condense the information I've learned and from books and what I also experienced on one hand. And on the other hand, if you're doing serious games, very often or usually you interact with a subject domain experts and or pedagogicians. And along the way, a lot of communication issues in the collaboration arise. And so, of course, then the job of the designer / programmer is to familiarize himself with the terminology of the domain expert and to ask questions. But on the other hand, what I very often saw is that the domain experts gets irritated about a lot of seemingly unimportant details that are asked. So what I would like to do is give you an introduction here to maybe understand why certain questions are important to me or in general the designer of a serious game. Yeah, just to give you an explanation, in contrast to a lot of people you hear talking about serious games, I've not just read books about it and I'm talking about it, but I've actually also done it. So my professional career you can roughly divide in two halves. The first half was in the game industry and the second half was at a university. And during the first half, I worked for 5 years in Germany. And there I was working as a programmer on the PC games Aquanox and Aquanox 2. Afterwards, I was also working as a programmer in Canada on Splinter Cell Conviction and Splinter Cell Essentials. And then on the Iron Man PSP version, and afterwards I also worked at a company that worked for EA, and they also got a credit for a component which went into Army of 240's Day. Afterwards, during my time at university, besides doing teaching and writing papers, I also still developed games. So I started first here in the role as a designer and programmer on the independent title Angus Hates Aliens, which appeared as a PlayStation Portable Mini, and that I mainly did in collaboration with an artist, Jörg Meyer. Yeah, then, so that was still a non-serious title. And then I ventured into the realm of the serious games, and the first serious game I did was a VR title on the economic theory of Karl Marx. And that was about teaching the core mechanics of the economic model of Karl Marx. And that was done in a collaboration with the Karl Marx House, which is a local museum here at Trier. And yeah, for that game I became a finalist at the Series Showcase at the Series Games Showcase and Challenge competition. Afterwards, I did a game on crowd and panic simulation. So the objective of that game was to install fences in crowd situations to basically minimize the amount of casualties that you would get in that crowd stamp panic. For that game, I also got also became a finalist then 2 years later at the Serious Games Showcase and Challenge, and now just in December I became a finalist for Holobrand. And Holobrand was a game that was done in collaboration with the economics department of our university. And Holobrand is a co-located augmented reality game. Means it's a multiplayer game in augmented reality where all players act in the same space. And Holobrand is about placing products on a three-dimensional market described by a specific market model, and it is about either maximizing for wealth or for profit. Okay, yeah, so much just for my background and to explain that I also have experience knowledge in doing serious games. Yeah, as I said in the discussion I will bring up now, I will kind of combine theoretical book knowledge and experience knowledge from developing those games. If I try to think about that subject matter, I pretty much would like to share the perspective of Jesse Schell that he has used also in the book, in his book, The Book of Lenses, where he said, well, game design is a subject matter where you can have a lot of perspectives on. And I think the same also holds true for the subject matter of serious games. So you kind of get a web of a lot of subjects that are interrelated with each other. What I would like to take here as an approach is more like a top-down perspective, so that I try to identify several subjects and then go later on into more detail and detail all these subjects and try to find the interrelation between those. It's like the knowledge I will discuss here in that video basically goes down to a layer 2 or 3 in the subject hierarchy. So I try to stick with a more high-level description here. Okay, so the highest level of description I would like to discuss is, or where I would like to start is the description of Hartevelds, which you can find in his book Triadic Game Design. So that's kind of the top level description of serious games, or specifically games for a learning context. So what he does is he basically splits the whole subject matter into 3 regions: reality, meaning, and play. So what is meaning in this case? So meaning is kind of twofold here. It's the learning objective. So it's like, what do you want to learn in that game? And on the other hand, it is the game objective. So what does the player try to do in that game? The aspect of reality is, well, you want to learn something about the world, and this something being about the world is the reality that goes into your game in a more or less distorted form. So that's the aspect of reality. And there's also the difference to kind of also real games, so non-serious games, because here your reality may be anything fantasy related, whereas in serious games, well, the reality you have in serious games should kind of correspond to the real reality. So, or other words, you should have a certain validity in your reality aspect. And the third part is, so meaning and reality is, if we only take those, we could also think of, let's say, classical simulations like flight simulators or whatever. But now the third component comes in, is that we would like to have fun. So fun is also important for the learning aspect because it increases your engagement. Okay, now of course, although three subjects are very large for themselves, so we will see for meaning there's kind of like what is learning, the experiential part associated with it, reality, because we want to reflect the reality. We will see there's a lot of thoughts coming in from the modeling and simulation direction. And of course, play, like what do I need to do to make a fun game, is also a very large part for itself. Now, as I've already said, when you are working on a serious game as a developer, chances are that you will either have a subject domain expert and or a client from who you do the game. Usually they both are the same person. And both of them both of them get in touch with all three aspects, so with reality, meaning, and play. Principally, the focus of the specialist is more on the reality and meaning part, because from that point of view, you get, first of all, the learning objective. What do I want to learn? And then, of course, the specialist has to describe to you what the reality is, so what in the end you have to model and simulate. And for the meaning part, we will see that, well, the developer has more aspects on the game objectives, and of course on the question on how do you make things fun. But as I said, that's only a rough division, so that's more a focus point, because in the end both get in touch with all subject matters, and of course both have very different perspectives, and so you will have to find a common terminology. And as I said, basically my motivation or my background here is to also provide a bit of perspective and terminology to the specialist, and also may explain to the specialist why certain questions are arised also relatively early in the development phase, which may seem to be for the specialist unimportant and or annoying. Here we see the first decomposition steps of the aspects of reality, meaning, and play. So I will start with meaning. As I said, is first we can decompose it by learning objective, so by describing what does the player has to learn in the game, and following from that the game objective, so what does the player actually has to achieve in the game. That game objective is derived from learning objective. Kind of sounds trivial, but in a lot of serious games it is actually not. So what you see very often is what is sometimes called the chocolate coated broccoli effect, is that they are not related with each other. So that, for instance, well, you want to do the objective of the game is that the player is capable of, let's say, adding numbers. And how it is put into the game is then that you have a first-person shooter, and in the first-person shooter you find crates which you can open by adding numbers. But then the primary game objective is to kill all the people in the first-person shooter, which is essentially not a direct derivation from the learning objective that the player has to be able to add numbers in a short amount of time. Okay, but I will go into detail into this later. The aspect of reality can be kind of learned from the modeling and simulation community, where basically the idea is simulation is execution of model over time, and the model is time-dependent, so it's the description of a time-dependent system. So yeah, that is kind of the static description of how our world behaves, and the simulation is the execution of it. What you will find in games very often is the concept of game mechanics. So a game mechanic is essentially a combination of a game objective with the model. Then we have the aspect of fun. So fun is a beast in itself, and basically I divided it here into the aspects of a synthetic and an analytical aspect. And in the synthetic aspect, I will use as a base the description, the 4 fun factor model of Lazzaros. And in analysis, I will use the player experience and need satisfaction scale. As I said, the analysis is done as a way on how to analyze an existing game. But of course, if you know how to analyze an existing game, you may also extract information and cues on it, on how to design it and make it fun. And so that's the rough idea. And what I want to do now is first discuss in a bit more detail all the 6 different aspects we see here. And once I've discussed them, then comes the real interesting part, that is kind of the interrelation and how do they influence each other. And in consequence also which communication issues arrived from those aspects that I mentioned already in the introduction. Okay, let's start with the most important aspect, and also the aspect you should start with if you discuss and design a serious game, that is the learning objective. So what does the player has to learn? Well, usually what you see from a client or as a first step is the player should learn about subject matter X. And yeah, that's kind of diffuse. And if you drill it further down, you will find that there are 2 types of learnings that become relevant. One has a defined name, that is so-called experiential learning, and the other one doesn't have one, so I just called it now textbook learning. So textbook learning, what is textbook learning? To start with, that's kind of like the classical learning, because either you read something from a textbook, or maybe you watch a video like you currently do, or you listen to somebody or whatever. And experiential learning is kind of learning from experience. And so I've shown here the scheme of Kolb, and that is one way on how to describe it. There are also concepts like that go into a similar direction, like the ODA loop in a military context, or there are also variations from Kolb's cycle. But roughly the idea is always the same. So the idea is you are in a certain situation, and then you start thinking about, what do I do in this situation to achieve something? So you think about it, then you act, and then you experience it. So you observe the results and you think about, well, did I get better? Did I achieve what I wanted to do? And then you reflect on that and then restart the iteration and start again. Okay, let's start with some examples for textbook learning and experiential learning. So let us take a subject matter, probably most of us are familiar with this, cycling. So you can read a book about cycling. So the book about cycling would probably start with the physics and dynamics of cycling. and would probably try to explain to you, if you're going into a corner, the aspect of counter-steering. So what is the aspect of counter-steering in cycling? Well, if you try to cycle a left-hand corner, what do you do with your steering bar? Well, first naive answer is, well, you point it to the left direction. That is actually not the case. You start pointing it to the right direction. Because while you pointed it to the right direction, you induce a fall over to the left side, and then you start turning left and kind of catch up the fall. So that's kind of the idea of counter-steering. And that is something most cyclists do subconsciously, and because they just learned cycling as a kid. And so that would be one aspect of it, and then would be braking and going on, how do you cycle in traffic situations and so on. So that would be textbook learning. So you could read a long textbook on that one. And afterwards, you probably have a pretty good overview of how cycling works. But if you go onto a bicycle now, and you can also talk to other people about it, about your knowledge and about your knowledge about cycling, but once you go onto a real bicycle, chances are that you will not get very far. So the other way to approach learning cycling, is probably the way you did as a kid, is your parent put you onto a bicycle. And first you had a kind of maybe a simplified version of a bicycle where there were no pedals on and you could still reach the ground with your feet. And so you are experiencing cycling and keeping balance in a reduced version in a very specific situation. So the specific situation is you're going in a straight line and you can put your feet on the ground. So it's not the real cycle yet. From there on, you went probably then to more complex situations, got the pedals mounted back on, and so on. So what is the difference between those two? So experiential learning is about being able to act in a specific situation. Seeing for the cycle, the first step is you want to keep balance on a bicycle without pedals, still able with your feet reaching the ground in a non-traffic situation. So it is about not being able to reproduce something, to talk to somebody or explain something, but to be able to act in a specific situation. On the other hand, if you're taking a look at textbook knowledge, so you read a book about cycling, and if you read a book about cycling, then you pretty much get a very good overview of what is all involved in cycling and how you proceed. And you get reproducible knowledge, so you can talk to somebody else about cycling. By the way, it's a bit the same, I think, also with game design in general. So you can read books, tons of books about game design, but if you have not designed a game yet, probably the first game you will do is about to be bad. That's also a word around game designers, something like the first 10 games you designed are going to be bad, so try to get them out of the way as fast as possible. I don't think if you just do it as fast as possible, you also don't learn a lot from them. But it's kind of the same idea here. So for instance, the first kind of design aspects I did was control programming. So you program a control for a game, and the first thing that happens is, well, you program it, or I programmed it, and it turned to be out bad. And first of all, it was not me that it discovered it was bad, but I let somebody else play it, and that was my best friend, and he just said, well, your controls just suck, to be honest. And well, they sucked. So what is happening then, or what happened then, is I said, well, yeah, maybe he's right. And then I took a look at other games of the same genre and tried to think about it is what did they do different. So that was kind of the aspect of experience and then reflecting what do they do different. And then I thought about, well, how do I improve on that? And then I proved it until I knew how to get the controls right for that specific game, and then later on also for different games. So, well, that is very specific. So I learned on how to make controls well, and programming controls is a subpart of the CCC problem, character, camera, and control. And the CCC problem is a part of the game mechanic problem, and the game mechanic problem is a part of the game design problem. So it's very specific, and it's about acting. So if you read a book about game design in general, probably they will somewhere explain the CCC problem and then kind of mention the control aspect. So yeah, you get an overview there. But from that overview and from the description, being able actually to program good controls is a long way. So this means that textbook learning is overview, has a very good overview character and is broad. And experiential learning for a very specific experience will always be very isolated and be for very specific situations. So this means that probably you will have to have different learning cycles for different aspects of a broad subject matter. And now the question comes, which is interesting for testing and comparing. So this means, let's say, for instance, the subject matter you're teaching was previously done as pure textbook learning. And now you want to introduce some kind of experiential learning with serious games and want to compare it. Do I get better? Now the question is, how do I measure and compare them? So, well, if you make kind of a questionnaire and ask about knowledge, then chances are that your textbook learning version is going to be better because, well, that's the point of textbook learning, that you can reproduce knowledge. And if you do something like a practical situation where you put somebody in a situation and that person has to act in that situation, then possibly experiential learning is going to get better. So it's like, well, if you're doing a serious game and want to measure it in the game, then of course, well, the idea is if you play the game, then you become better at playing the game. So that's kind of the issue you see, or the question that arises if you want to measure the success of a learning endeavor with serious games. Now, in the discussion, you very often find being the two aspects of learning, so experiential learning and textbook learning, in a conflict situation where very often it is said, well, that experiential learning is the more modern way to do it and should replace textbook learning. Actually, I think they are both good, but they are both good for different purposes. As I said, it's like textbook learning is good for getting an overview and being able to reproduce knowledge, and experiential learning is good for learning on how to act in a very specific situation. So they are just two tools for different aspects, or something like you need to have a hammer and a screwdriver to put up your furniture, something like this. And like you can use both of them to put up your furniture, I also think you can actually use both of them in your learning endeavor. And in fact, they can also be incorporated, both aspects, into a serious game. So what we see here on the first picture is the question on how can we incorporate textbook learning in experiential learning. So if you are taking the experiential learning cycling of Kolb, so then one part is actually doing the experience, that is acting and experiencing. And the second part is then reflecting on what we have done and then thinking about on how we can continue. So In the last two steps, we can kind of inject textbook learning. So how can we inject textbook learning? There are basically two ways on how to do it. One is we actually have a person or a mentor that observes and or participates also in the experiential learning, and during the reflection and thinking process kind of refers to textbook knowledge. So, for instance, if you were thinking about, that's a bit artificial now, it's about the cycling issue. So if you're cycling and you're falling over, then maybe your dad or your mother maybe said, well, I sent you to keep the steering straight to avoid falling over. So that would be then kind of injecting textbook knowledge. And you can also do it automatically in a game. That was actually one of the first projects I worked on in my career, was about language learning. And so one aspect of the language learning is, of course, the pronunciation. And so at this part, we were discussing with the company, and the company had a speech recognizer, but the speech recognizer was operating on a whole word basis. So if you think about it, what you actually need is you need to have a recognizer that works on a phoneme basis, and that also has an error model in there. So if you do want to do a speech analysis and then inject textbook knowledge on how to pronounce something correctly, you need to identify the pronunciation mistakes the persons do. So one classical for German speakers like me here is trying to speak English is the pronunciation of TH, where you can do a lot of mistakes. And so you need to have an error model and to identify those mistakes, or in general some form of AI that can identify mistakes or things that could have been done better, and then explain to the learner, textbook knowledge, on how to approach that situation. The second version is the one that you will actually find more often. And it's also easier to implement and also has a lot of beneficial side advantages I want to take into. So we took a look at saying that, well, textbook knowledge has the big advantage of giving you the broad context on subject matters. And what we can do now is kind of keep the textbook knowledge as a frame, and at certain parts we kind of spin out different experiential aspects of it. Let's take a look at an example. Let's take a look at history. So history is something what I hated at school. Basically, what was history about at school is about learning by heart a long list of who has fought whom in which war, at which point of time, at which location. And But now the argument for learning history was, well, if you know history, then maybe you can take a look at the present and think about what may happen in the future. Okay, now think about it. The issue of learning a long list who has fought whom by heart is very much textbook knowledge. And the ability to decide in a very specific situation what may happen in the future is something you may gain from experiential knowledge. Okay, so there was nothing related to experiential knowledge in history lessons. So how could you do something like this in history lessons? So if the history lesson is pretty much geared towards learning by heart a long list of wars, then of course the question would be, how can you experience something like war in terms of what would be the consequences? So practical approach here in terms of experiential learning would be wargaming. Okay, so the first step or first idea would be to say, okay, let's grab all the history stuff we have at school and replace it with a series of war games. Okay, in the war game, think about it, you have a very specific war game for a very specific war, and that also makes a lot of simplifying assumptions. So you may learn something about certain interdependencies, but of course war game takes a long time and you need to learn the war game. So maybe in the history at school you, I don't know, covered maybe 150 wars and also this time in between the wars. And maybe you can do, I don't know, 10 wars or whatever during school if you only focus on wargaming. So it will be only 10 wars and they will also cover certain sub-aspects of the wars. And yeah, so probably the best solution would be here also a combination of both. Because if you're doing wargamings on an isolated wars, you're kind of lacking the complete context. So it would be kind of taking a flashlight in a large dark room and only highlighting certain spots. So probably the best way on how to approach it would be a combination, so that we say, well, we take the textbook aspect, so what we also currently do in school as a frame, but then at certain wars, at certain specific wars, we will play a war game on that war to find out what has actually happened or what might have happened if certain things would have been changed. So probably that would be the best solution to go back. If you think about the overall learning objective that was originally used to say, well, you should be able to kind of make a prediction about what may happen in the future depending on the current situation on a political scale. Yeah, and the other aspect of which makes this approach very favorable is pacing. When we will discuss the fun aspect later on of games, we will go into hard fun. And hard fun is pretty much related to the aspect of pacing. Pacing means that you kind of want to alternate during the experience phases of height, tension and stress and relief. You see something like this also in non-serious games. So in non-serious games you have the different levels, and at the end of the level you have a boss fight or something like this, so very high tension. And then you have maybe some cutscene in the middle where some story or whatever gets told, so where you can pretty much relax. So this thing is also pretty much related to the concept of flow. And what we can do now also from that perspective is to say, well, okay, we have a series of experiential parts in there, which are kind of stressful, and then we put in kind of textbook learning parts in between them. So kind of we get a relief here from the experiential part, but it's also the other way around. Now, if you think about this video here, I talked to you now for a very long time. So you probably interrupt sometimes the video in the meantime, but if not, it will be very hard for you to keep your concentration for that amount of time. So if we combine those two aspects, we basically get an alternation in mental load on different aspects, which is in general very favorable. For instance, for the game Holobrand, I incorporated both aspects into the game. So there's a sequence of missions that are played, and before and during and in between those missions, basically PowerPoint slides are shown that further explain certain aspects or provide textbook knowledge. And the game also has a debriefing mode where after the mission has been completed, kind of the instructor can go through the mission and then explain on certain aspects and certain decisions that have been done by the different players. Yeah, the next step then is the game objective. And as already mentioned, well, if you do it right, then they should be relatively closely related to the learning objective. So if you're thinking about experiential learning, as I said, is the learning objective in an experiential setting is obtaining the ability to act in a specific situation. And the relation to the game objective then is, well, to perform well in this strain specific situation. So this means that if you're thinking about the bicycle thing, for instance, again, so when you were a child and your parents put you on a bicycle without the pedals, then the game objective would be to go in a straight line for, I don't know, 15 meters and without falling from the bicycle. So that would be the game objective, one possible game objective. Another possible later on game objective would be to cover the distance in a certain amount of time, or later on also to include a corner, going around a corner or whatever. And as you already see, these game objectives sound very blatant or simple, but actually that is what you also very often find in game design. If you take a high-level description of a good game, it is very often very simple. So take, for instance, Tetris, for instance. What is the game mechanics of Tetris? Or the game objective in Tetris is to put geometric objects as close to each other as possible. The other way is not true, so not every simple or simplistic description makes a good game. But anyway, if we take a look at more concrete aspects now, game objectives, I would like to distinguish between single player and multiplayer. So more serious games you find are single player games, but I went more with the now into the direction of multiplayer serious games because I think they're more interesting. But I would like to categorize those two what types of game objects game objectives you can have. So for single player, it's a bit more simple. So for a single player, you can get a score. So you get a gradually fulfillment of your game objective. Getting a score would probably, or is for instance for if you take this bicycle problem, then if we have a time measurement from going from A to B, then the score would be that time, or more specifically than the average velocity you had. Or for the liquid marks, for instance, where you were the game I did where you are acting in a virtual economy mark style, then getting the score would be the amount of profit you made or something like this. And the other way on how to define a game objective would be a binary decision. So something like succeeded, not succeeded, or pass test, not pass test. So for instance, for crowd disaster, it was something like that. Could you evacuate a certain area in a certain amount of time? Yes, no. Or you can also build a combination of those two so that you can say, well, for instance, for the evacuation in a certain amount of time, you can make it binary to say, well, you need to have be lower than a certain amount of time to evacuate the area. But then also, of course, it is scored with the time that you need it, and therefore you can also keep the score and try to get a better score for that one. And of course, you can also build something like the beloved badge system, like where you can say, well, you need a certain score to pass the test, but then you can get whatever badge for it if you reached even a better score. Multiplayer, it gets a bit more complicated. So first of all, we can take the same objectives as single player. That's a bit weird. Why should we do something like this? So that would essentially be a single player game in a multiplayer game. Pragmatically, you have this very often in terms of tutorial missions or briefing missions. And that is also what I included in Holobrand, where first you interact independently from the other players in your own market region, and other players are not interfering with you. So the idea here is again that we something like what I explained also with the bicycle, that we try to make different scenarios with more complex demands and then also more complex game objectives. And the idea here is that we go and first do a more simplistic type of mission without the social interaction being involved. Now, if we get to social interaction in games, then basically we can distinguish three types of games. And these are adversarial, cooperative, and collaborative games. So adversarial is kind of the classical game where players are playing against each other. So you can have either a winner and all the others are losers, or you can have place 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. So that's the classical situation. And I would say most types of multiplayer games are this classical situation. So that's also the case for Holobrand, where you must be the person who has the most money in the end or has the highest profit or whatever. The second type of game is, now we have to pay attention because I will say later on that I also saw other definitions of cooperative and collaborative in social science. But here now I will also explain what the difference is. But here now I'm referring to the game version of these terms. So a cooperative game is essentially a game where all players win or all players lose. So you win or you lose together. So cooperative games are typically games which you play against a game. So in computer games and computer MMOs, most that's a bit difficult. So there are cooperative games like the couch cooperative games where two players are playing together in a game. You have it more often in board games. So one very famous cooperative board game is Pandemic. And the general idea in cooperative games is you have different players and they have different acting abilities and they play against the game, and then they either altogether win or they lose. In general, cooperative games, especially in the realm of board games, suffer the so-called alpha problem. What is the alpha problem? This means, or the alpha problem is the effect you very often see if you have a cooperative game, that you have one person who owns the game or who is very knowledgeable or whatever, who kind of determines the ongoing of the game and kind of commands the other persons around on what to do. And this is kind of then, of course, becomes boring, because then it becomes more or less a solitary game for that alpha person. What options do you have to break this? There are basically two ways on how to break it. Option number one is you artificially limit the communication possibilities the different players have. So that is, for instance, done in the game Magic Maze, so where you have different players with different abilities, but they are not allowed to talk during certain phases. So in this case, it basically comes down to guessing what does the other person think in the moment. And the second option is what is very often done in computer games, in MMO type of games. Basically, you try to look for an information overload. So you intentionally also have an alpha person or an alpha that is leading the others, but there is simply so much information to be processed in a certain amount of time that the real or specific alpha person simply cannot process all that information, but has to delegate tasks. In board games, this is usually very difficult because there is simply not so much information to be processed. And the third type of game is the collaborative game or semi-cooperative game. Formally, a collaborative game is a game where you may have several winners and several losers. And so if you take a look at it from a structural point of view, what we very often have is we also have different players with different skills. So they strictly speaking, a symmetric game with role distribution. And then we have something like there is one aspect would be there is a common goal. And to be able to win the game, the common goal has to be reached. And on top of that, there are individual goals. And those individual goals, they are adversarial. So this means that when I manage to get the goal, you will not be able to get it. And in order to win the game, both goals have to be reached. And one aspect for this, for putting this into a serious game, what is currently discussed is, for instance, you have an airport and you have different airlines at the airport and you have a ground management system and so on. And in the end, but all of them try to get the most money out of it, so it's adversarial. But if they go very much unfavorable because of the customers who book the flights, then the whole airport goes bankrupt and everybody loses. So that would be an example of a collaborative game. A second way on how to approach collaborative would be to introduce also a traitor mechanic. So that's, for instance, done in the board game Battlestar Galactica, where you say with a certain probability there's a traitor in there, and the objective of the traitor is exactly the opposite of the common goal, so that the common goal is not reached, plus eventually an individual goal. So with collaborative games, you basically break the problem of the alpha, because if there's a player who says something, no, I'm not going to follow that player because he has his own personal agenda, and very often in collaborative games also this personal agenda, so the personal objective, which is adversarial, may not be known to other players. So that means that if a certain player does a decision, you don't really know whether this decision is based on the common goal or his specific goal. And also, of course, if you have the possibility of a traitor being in there, you don't know, maybe this person who tries to play the alpha is maybe the traitor. So that kind of breaks that situation. So these are the most interesting ones. Interesting here for it is also where you have to pay attention. I had a discussion with somebody from the social science part, and they were also using the terms cooperative and collaborative, and I mistakenly interpreted them the way they are interpreted in the game's context, but they were actually meant different. So cooperative for them is a situation where in game terms it's a cooperative game, but where you have very specific roles with people with very specific abilities. And a collaborative game, in their terminology, is again like a cooperative game in the games world, but you don't have very defined roles that you have in the cooperative situation. So this means for collaborative, the working together part actually becomes more complicated, because essentially here most people can do most things, and so you have to divide the works and the roles between themselves. So that was the part for meaning. So we discussed learning objective and game objective, and this was also the largest part. And the next part we are going to talk about is reality. Okay, the next subject matter is reality. Here I'm referring a bit to the terminology that is used in the modeling and simulation community. So, as the name says, we are differentiating here between a simulation and a model. And a simulation in general is simply the execution of the model, or as specific in our case, because we are talking about games, it is the interactive execution of a model. So this means that we, besides the time, we also insert the user input here. And what is a model now? In general, it's a mathematical description of a time-dependent system. So this is basically it. So we try to describe the reality usually in a mathematical way, and reality itself is a time-dependent system. So where situations very much depend on the time. And well, that probably some people from the MNS community are now going to rip my head off because I condense everything down to a couple of sentences. But in general, we can distinguish here between discrete models. So this means that time is passing, and at certain points in the future, certain things will happen instantaneously. Or the continuous model, where we have a continuous dependency of our quantities depending on our time. So think about like room temperature or flow or whatever. So they are described mathematically differently, and in games or interactive simulations in general, we usually have a mixture of both. So like for instance, if you're a Unity programmer, you may know this. So you have the update method, and you can also create coroutines that terminate at a certain point in the future and then initiate some events. So the important part now is what is a model? I said besides the more technical description, a model is a reduced and distorted subset of reality, more or less. So a model of the reality is never reality itself, and however you want to model it, you will have to leave out certain aspects. And you may also introduce distortions or errors at that point. So if you think about weather, for instance, usually what people do is, well, you have air and you have temperature in the air and you have the clouds and so on, but you do not include in the model the animals that are running on the ground. But eventually one of those animals will influence the weather in the end, because it's a very, very unstable system. So so the question is always, well, in the end you have to reduce your model. And now the question is it still okay? So is it, technically speaking, is it valid? And the question of validity very much depends on, in general, in modeling and simulation, on what you want to use your model for. And now this obviously refers to a learning objective and game objective. But as I said, it's like very often a point in discussion I have with other people, so who are on the expert side of the subject matter, because then, of course, they always say, we still need to include this and this and this, because reality is so much more complex. But what are the criteria in our context to reduce and eventually distort reality? So first of all, there are technical constraints. So technical constraints are, the more complex your model is, the more time you need to model and program it, and also the more computation time you need. And you might also get the effect which you have in machine learning as the overfitting problem. So that means that a more complex model is not necessarily more valid than a simpler model, because you may catch up on error measurements or whatever, and the model may start to interpret dependencies in there that do not really exist in reality. So that's why, for instance, very often you see linear models, and linear is the most simplistic model that exists, but it's not usually the worst one, because if you take more complex models, you may catch up on errors. Then you have the learning objective. So if something of your reality is very far from your learning objective, then it may be unnecessary to model it, because it's not part of your learning objective, and therefore it shouldn't be part of your game objective. And B, it may also be additionally disturbing for the player/user, and deviate from your objective, unless one of your learning objectives is the ability to distinguish important from unimportant information for the task intent. So that may be something you may have to take into account if you build your model. And the last aspect is the aspect of play. So from a game designer's point of view, you may reduce your model intentionally and also distort it, so make it more extreme than reality. That is what we will see in the with the aspect of competence. So the more direct and more simplistic a model is, the more easy it is for me to understand, and the more easy for me it is to get better at it. And yeah, and also from a learning point of view, distorting may be an idea if you want to highlight a certain aspect of reality. So this means, for instance, that if you are in a competitive situation, that you may want to highlight the aspect that if you are alone in the market cluster, that you have a higher advantage or whatever. So, but you have to be very cautious about this additional distortion, because it may lead to errors later on in reality. But anyway, reduction is very important, and reduction is usually a point of debate with a potential customer or with a potential subject expert, because it's kind of the effect that if you ask them what can we leave out, that I don't know, I'm reluctant to leave this out. Anyway, so that was simulation, that was reality, being defined here as the combination of simulation and model. And if you think about it from game perspective, in the game you usually talk about mechanics. And mechanics is essentially a combination of model, which reflects on reality, and the game objective. Okay, after we have discussed meaning and reality, the last subject left is the subject matter of play. Yeah, the subject matter of play is in general the question of how do I make a game fun? And this, of course, is the whole domain of game design, and there are tons of books written on it. And of course, what I also do here, like the same as with reality, that I only address a small subset of it. So of course, this is of course here a subjective choice of what I've picked. Is I picked on the synthesis side more the for fun factor model of Nicole Lazzaros, and on the analysis side, so that's the question of how do I measure a game, I picked the player experience and need satisfaction scale, or more specifically the dimensions of it. So for that scale, the claim is, and I just picked this one, so in the meantime there are already very similar scales that basically address aspects in psychology, as far as I know, this is the self-determination theory. And the intention here is that with this kind of measurement, it's you can do a more reliable prediction of whether some person will play this game still sometime in the future than simply asking, was the game fun? Okay, but let's start with the 4 fun factor model. So the 4 fun factor model distinguishes 4 types of fun: hard fun, easy fun, serious fun, and people fun. So hard fun is kind of the competitive aspects of fun. So this means you are challenged with some kind of obstacle which is hard to overcome. You get frustrated while trying to overcome the obstacle, and finally you managed to have overcome the obstacle, and you get some kind of so-called fiero, which is the Italian expression for pride in overcoming the obstacle. Hard fun is very much related, so most competitive sports are in the category of hard fun. And hard fun is very much related to the concept of flow and pacing. So pacing, as I said, it's like you get periods of excitement and stress, and in between relaxation. And using this type of pacing is also the best way on how to introduce the concept of flow, which also helps learning in the end. So hard fun is kind of what you may know also from action games, what is mostly used in this case. The second concept is easy fun. Easy fun, also like hard fun, contains 2 contradictory emotions, where hard fun it was like frustration, fiero. Easy fun, it's a bit more like a boredom and surprise. So easy fun is kind of the aspect what you very often have in explorational game mechanics. So you walk and run around, and certainly you find something interesting, beautiful, and whatever. Pay attention here. Easy fun is not to be confused with the relaxation part of hard fun. So easy fun is an entire dimension of its own, where you try to introduce fun from looking at things. So games, for instance, that are very much balanced or geared towards easy fun are things like Flow or The Journey or stuff like that. Serious fun. Basically, serious fun is based on all the things that relate to breaking out of the magic circle. So is there something that you still have and still own once the game is finished? So serious fun can be based on like those things like you have a high score somewhere in the list, or you got a badge or something like that. But of course, it is also for serious games interesting, there especially if you have a clear learning objective that you as a player know, okay, I take something out of the game concerning the learning objective, so that if I encounter in reality a comparable situation, I will be more capable of mastering it. So that's the aspect of serious fun. And then we have the aspect of people fun. And people fun is essentially everything that is part of multiplayer games. So where you enjoy simply the game with playing with or against game objective other people. So that's people fun. So this is what I find relatively intuitive and easy to use. And so what usually you try to do is cover all 4 aspects of fun. So if I take my last game, for instance, the Holobrand game, I cover all four aspects. So I cover hard fun by having the competitive aspect so that you compete against a clear objective or against other players. And I also introduce here a ramping curve, so I make it increasingly more difficult and put breaks in between, and also change the type of difficulty in between. So that also refers to hard fun. I also have an aspect of easy fun in there, because the visualization of the market segments or the market structures, they may look very bizarre in 3 dimensions in the hologram in front of you. So it's always a discovery for a new player to start a new scenario and to get overwhelmed by the structure of that new scenario. Serious fun, in our case, is pretty much clear. So you are learning something about a market model, or to be more specific, you learn on how to optimize your product positions in a market model. So there is something that you may take out of this to either place your products yourself or understand on how mass consumer markets work. And people fun is also covered, because it's a multiplayer game and you compete against other players and you discuss things with them and so on. So on the analysis side, what we have on the analysis side is the aspect of competence. So a game is fun or satisfying for me if I feel competent. Now the question is, how do I get the feeling of competence? There are 2 things that are really important for this one. So the first thing is I need to have clean, simple objectives. So for instance, I read a paper or a concept of somebody for something to be modeled as a serious game, and there the objective, so the game objective, was a score calculation that was covering 2 pages. Not that good from a perspective of competence, because if I need to read the 2 pages and make up an Excel spreadsheet for it and put everything in there, then it should be relatively difficult for a player to get a feeling of what exactly do I need to do now. And the other aspect of competence is referring to the model. So the world around me in which I act must give me clear and direct feedback on my actions. You also have it, for instance, in shooter games. So if you have a rocket launcher and you fire the rocket launcher, then you have a fat muzzle flare for your rocket launcher and the rocket flies out, because the rocket needs some time to reach its destination. But in this case, you get a direct feedback when you fire the rocket launcher and have the impression, wow, I just fired a fat rocket. So that's kind of the idea. The second aspect is of autonomy. So in autonomy, you want to feel free and be able to do what you want. Now, the important part is here, you want to feel free. Because if you think about it, if you give the player real freedom, then this is not a good idea. Because if you give the player real freedom, so that kind of contradicts the competence dimension, the player may do a lot of things, but nothing that is currently required in that situation. So, for instance, also from a learning perspective, it's like if you have some modern style approach where you say, okay, kids sit down and write something about something. So you have full free autonomy, you can do whatever your imagination wants. Problematic, likely not going to work out. So basically the idea is autonomy is an illusion. Think about it. You're, for instance, now probably sitting in a room, watching at a screen, hearing me talk. Okay, you're sitting in the room. The room probably has 1 or maybe 2 exit doors, and possibly it has some windows to the outside. Okay, Now, if you think about it, yeah, you can look outside, and there's some outside, but looking outside of the window is an illusionary degree of freedom that you have, because chances are you're not going to jump out of the window because maybe your window is too high or whatever. And of course, then you can get out of the room, so you can walk around the room and whatever, but in the end, there is a door and you have to walk through that door, period. And the third constraint that you have is time. Okay, now you're sitting in the room watching me talk, but at a certain point you will need to get some food, drink, go to the restroom or whatever, or have another appointment. So at a certain point of time, you will have to leave the room and go through that door. Of course, you may walk around in the room, and before you go through the door, you may take different paths to the door or whatever, but in the end, you have to go through the door. Okay, now think about situation 2. You're sitting in a closed room without any windows, or something like this here with a closed window that I have, and there is a brick wall around in the room through the straight line to the door, and you can only walk exactly that line. And then you have a clock at the wall, and the clock at the wall tells you how much time do you have left till you have to go, period. So that feels a lot less free than the first situation I've described, but essentially you exactly have the same amount of degrees of freedom. And yeah, interestingly, I once talked to a psychologist about this phenomenon, and she said, yeah, that's right. Most people totally overestimate the degrees of freedom they have. The only people that estimate them correctly are the ones that are depressive. And but to get non-depressive, this is exactly the same mechanics that we will use in providing the illusion of autonomy in games. So we will see later on, I will readdress the issue, is what I said with the going through the door effect is what is called in games the convexity principle. So this means you have one certain point where you enter, then you can go into the future in different paths, but then it converges again to one point. So think about chess, for instance. There are only very few openings and very few close gamings and somewhere in the middle. And with computer games, you have something what some people call the sausage model. So you have a couple of levels that are queued one behind the other. So you may do in the level certain different things, very unpredictable, but at the end you have to leave the level at a certain point, and there's only very little information that you can carry over to the next level. So this means, okay, this is illusion. Immersion is the question of, yes, how do you feel immersed in the situation? And here, what becomes relevant here is the question of fidelity, especially in serious games, the question of fidelity versus validity. So I can feel immersed in a game that is, or in an environment that is not the environment that I'm directly referring to, but that is related in the relevant parts to that environment. For instance, what I did in Liquid Marks, so that was also an economic series game. And of course, you have things like capital, money, whatever. And these are relatively abstract concepts. And if I want to construct an environment that kind of feels more physical and real, I took the idea of representing money with liquid. That's why also Liquid Marks. So you get different glasses of water, and the water in the glasses represent money. And so you're standing at a kind of chemistry table, and you're mixing the different water types in terms now capital types. So that's obviously not directly referring to the situation in the environment, but it's still a valid environment because all the laws that are within Marx' theory model are included in this one. On the other hand, what I once saw in a conference, so that was a kind of a military simulation for a machine gun in a helicopter. And the machine gun was really physically detailed, modeled with ammunition belt and whatever hanging out of the machine gun. But the gunner had a VR helmet on. So you didn't see the ammunition belt anyway, so you could also have left it out. So that's kind of a superficial immersion or closeness to reality, which is very often called fidelity, which is usually very often not the point. And the last point is relatedness. So the relatedness means how are you related in objects and people in the game. So you see, relatedness is pretty much related to people fun, because relatedness, of course, primarily is introduced if you have other human players playing with you. But relatedness also refers to NPCs in the game or to certain objects in the game that become kind of important during the game because they get important to you because of their action possibilities. Okay, so that was the aspect of fun. As I said, it's pretty much boiled down to here to 2 points, and it's very much arguable whether these are the most important points. So if you are of a different opinion, of course, feel free to write down in the comments below this video. Okay, so we talked about the synthesis and analysis aspect of fun, and basically we have now talked about all the different ingredients between that I put in reality, meaning in play. And the remainder of the talk is now all about the, for me, relevant interdependencies between those different subjects. So starting again from the very top, so as I said, is you should start with the learning objective. And if you condense down your learning objectives to the aspects of experiential learning, so that means that the specific learning objective is about acting in a specific situation, then you can derive from that more or less directly the game objective that the player has to meet in that part. So as I said, for instance, with the bicycle, if it's about the experiential aspect is here about being able to go in a straight line with your bicycle and the foot on the ground, then the game objective would be to have a certain amount of time to go from A to B and without leaving your track being a line and surrounded with a certain distance. So important for here is, of course, if you think about back, you may have larger learning objectives which may be mangled together with textbook learning objectives. So it's fine to have so and to do so. But if you're doing now here a serious game for certain aspects of it, focus on the specific situations where you want the player to train in. So they can, of course, be embedded, as I said originally, into a textbook scenario. And you may also have different scenarios, but yeah, every scenario should have its own learning objective and therefore also its specific game objective. So for instance, with Holobrand, I divided it up into several chunks or several learning objectives. So basically the first chapter, which were first 4 missions, is to be able to place one product into the optimal market position with 2 competing players. And then the second chapter is the learning objective is to place up to 3 products on the market with competing players in optimal position. And fourth chapter is additionally being able to create and cancel existing products. And fourth chapter is the ability to adjust to changing market conditions concerning the customer side. So yeah, so these are the different learning objectives, and from them the game objectives, or then specifically level or mission objectives, or how you ever want to call them, are more or less derived directly by providing saying something like, yeah, place 3 products on the market in a specific market situation that was varying between level and level under different optimization conditions, either for condition A is for wealth or for profit. Okay, so the second topic is of how are all the aspects of meaning and reality related. So there are quite a couple of them. So we can start with a learning objective versus model. So as I said, it's like for the model we have to decide on usually a reduction, not usually we have to reduce. So it's always a subset of what we reflect on reality. And eventually we may contain aspects of reality or may unintentionally or intentionally distort them. And of course, then the question is for the validity of the model, and the validity pretty much depends on the question why you endeavored in this model and simulation project anyway. And in our case of a serious game, the ultimate starting point for this is the learning objective. So the learning objective basically dictates you which is important or which aspects of reality are important. And even if you have included them, then the question of how exact do you need to be, or even if you want to maybe exaggerate them in a certain way, can be determined by your learning objective. Okay, the game objective. The game objective always runs down, at least in, as I said, in single player, is you need to do something. So you need to meet a certain criterion, or you measure some kind of score. So let's say, for instance, for the crowd disaster problem is about we need to measure how much time has passed, and we need to measure how many people have died, and we need to measure how long did it take to evacuate a certain area and stuff like that. So the game objective then describes on which type of information do you need to extract from the model, and of course then the model also has to provide this type of information. So the model is very much determined by the learning objective and the game objective. And the game objective also to a certain degree influences the simulation. So that's more a technical question also, because then if you have something like the game objective says, well, we have a multiplayer game, then this very much influences the simulation. So that's also what I experienced here in Holobrand, because that is a serious multiplayer game, is like you get a lot more technical aspects in there if you want to synchronize between different players, either locally or over the internet. So there are a lot of aspects that are coming in here also from the game objective into the simulation. Now the aspects we have just discussed, so basically the chain learning objective, game objective, model, and simulation are essentially the brain and spine part of your serious game. So this means getting these parts right is essential to your game. So other parts, like what we'll see in the fun part, of course, they play an important role and they may improve your game a lot or not so much. But the point is, if you don't get those 4 core parts right, your serious game will not work. And yeah, the issue now is that if you take a look at those 2 core parts, they are pretty much in the region of client and domain expert. And so this is the point where, from my experiences, a lot of communication issues arise. Also because to get this thing right, you need to take a lot of decisions, and usually relatively early in the project. And that's a bit uncomfortable for the client and the domain expert, because their perspective is more or less, well, you have come on board to make my life easier, and now you come and pile a lot of questions and you make my life more difficult, so what's the point? Anyway, the issue is like that if you do mistakes at that point in the early phases, they will be very hard, or other words, also more expensive to correct later on. So what I want to do now is go over the issues that I saw may easily happen. And we will start again with the aspect of learning objectives. So the first issue is kind of a diffuse learning objective, like I want to learn about subject matter X. Okay, so this does not help a lot. And so at this point, you should follow that what I've previously described to find out is, okay, what aspects of your domain that you want to learn can you reflect on with experiential learning, and on what aspects can you reflect on with textbook learning. So the second issue that may easily arise is, you get a bit more specific now, but the subject matters, or what you list now as learning objectives, become pretty much subject matters of textbook learning. So this means that for bicycle, I want to know how to corner, how to go straight, how to behave in traffic, how to do this, how to do that, whatever. And so probably also because if it is already an existing training program, chances are that it is the program is pretty much already in the textbook form. So what may be different then is what I saw is very much in the domain of defense and first responders, because they are more geared towards experiential learning primarily. So reason being is, of course, that those people need to learn on how to behave in certain situations under very stressful conditions. And learning on how to behave under stressful conditions is very much about automatizing certain aspects, which can pretty much only be done with experiential learning. So this means that at that point you have to be clear about, you have to divide on what you still want to do with textbook learning, what do you want to carry over with experiential learning, which aspects do you want, and how do you want to interleave those as described in the introductory slides. And the next problem that may arise is bullshit. What do I mean with this now? So from a university context, you very often see requirements, suggestions, whatever, coming from some point that you say, well, in your course you have to do about acquiring a social competency, about acquiring abstraction competencies, or competencies, one of those bullshit words. So what is bullshit? Bullshit is essentially a collection of ambiguous words that are used for identification in certain peer groups. So this means that ambiguous means they don't have a precise meaning or almost no meaning. And basically it's like, okay, I use those words, those words, we are same in the very important peer group, and we are very important, and so on. So they primarily have a social function, or with other words, their function is basically a variation of the Emperor's New Clothes theme. The high ambiguity of those words basically has two consequences. Consequence one is they're very difficult to criticize, because there is almost nothing behind it, or nothing behind it, it's also nothing to criticize, which is probably also the point of those words being used in the peer group. And question number two is which is more important in our case, is they're very hard to operationalize. Because if there's no meaning, I cannot turn them into action. To maybe give you an example to explain what I mean. If I take the learning objective of Holobrand, I would formulate it as follows. Holobrand is about placing products in a three-dimensional representation of the market according to Urban's model and optimizing either for wealth or for profit. Okay, that's it. This learning objective is operationalizable because I did it in the game, but it's also criticizable. So you can say, well, why do you pick 3 dimensions? Why not 2 or 4 or 5? Or why do you pick Urban's model and not model X, Y, Z or whatever? And why do you want to optimize for wealth and for profit? Maybe you want to optimize more for ecological aspects or ethical aspects or whatever. So there are a lot of points where you should ask about or can ask about. Okay, let's bullshitify this learning objective. Holobrand is about generating synergy effects in a VUCA environment simulated in the metaverse. Wow, fett, huh? So, you don't know what a VUCA environment is? Okay, obviously you're none of the cool kids. So that's basically a combination of buzzwords, and the game would fit towards that. So it's like synergy. Of course, you put several products into the market, so they kind of have to correspond to each other. VUCA, it's pretty much, we can argument, it's very volatile and uncertain because basically Urban's model is a non-linear model, and then you also have different competing players interacting with each other. So it really becomes pretty much a chaotic system. And metaverse, of course, it's an AR simulation and it's networked, and whatever you can otherwise understand under metaverse is also in there. So if you want to bullshitify it a bit more, you should also try to include the words AI and blockchain. Anyway, so here you see, okay, it's pretty much difficult to argue against that objective, whether it makes sense or not sense. And it's what we've done here with the with our game here, Holobrand, is of course only one interpretation of this rather diffuse statement. So basically, what you're looking for, and what I originally put in there, so game objectives and learning objectives are very often, or learning objectives in our case, very simplistic. So you see also the case with real games. So good learning objectives are very often very simplistically described, but not every simplistic description is a good description. But anyway, it is kind of the opposite of the bullshit description of what I've just mentioned. So you try to lean towards the simplistic ones. Okay, so the next issue we very often have is game objective. What is the problem with game objective? What may easily happen on the client side is that they have a certain taste for games and they have a certain domain they want to be reflected in the games, but they are not related to each other. So once I got asked by somebody who said, well, we would be interested in a game with the general subject matter of constructing networks, so in terms of hardware computer networks, and I love first-person shooters. So can't we make a first-person shooter with the aspect of constructing a computer network? So yeah, they are not related to each other, those subjects. So of course you can combine them artificially, and then you wind up in this chocolate covered broccoli scenario. So where you, for instance, say you have to answer questions on how to construct a network, so textbook knowledge, and you put textbook knowledge in there, and if you answer it correctly, then you get a better weapon or whatever. So of course, then the real thing would be first to go back to the learning objective and say, yeah, okay, first of all, it's about constructing networks. So, but what do I do in which situation, and where should I get better at? So that would be then the question for the learning objective. So that could be maybe based on the initial cabling or finding a bug or whatever. So you have to define those cases, and then as a second step, then you can construct a game objective around it, or better within it. Okay, so, and the next subject then that is of discussion is the question of the model. So what easily happens there is that for the model, of course, in the end you have to write code, so you have to get very specifically and mathematically. And so the first step is what you can borrow here from the modeling and simulation community is first you should start with a conceptual model. So you shouldn't try to force math out of your poor client. But the issue I see more often here is that is a problem of scope. So that the scope gets ill-interpreted by the domain expert or client in terms of that they say, well, but this and this and this and this and this is also important. But if you take a look at that, those aspects in the end are not related to the learning objective. And of course, it's also like, also from a purely modeling simulation point of view, is that if you make your model too complex, it may, as I said, also additionally get less valid than a more simplistic model. Yeah, on top of that, you also have the aspects that you very often have in traditional software development. So that people get irritated if you pile so many questions on top of them. And they say, well, can we just start and see maybe later on the details? And here it's, of course, later on there will also be a lot of details. But those central spine questions, so what is your learning objective and therefore the game objective, and what should be included in the model, to which degree and what not, is pretty much the core of it. And it is pretty much something, when you change it later on, you can basically start from point zero again. So that's very important here. And as I said, is basically this acts as learning objective, game objective, model, and also to a certain degree simulation. So the question is here for multiplayer. So introducing multiplayer later on. I had this phenomenon in my game industry time a lot. So that initially was called, no, we don't need multiplayer. And then later on, pretty much during production, can't you just include multiplayer also? This is very painful. So you try to avoid this one. So this acts as learning objective, game objective, model, and to a certain degree simulation is, as I said, pretty much the brain and spine of your serious game. And yes, so trying to get this right at the very beginning of a project is pretty much essential for the success later on. Now for the question of play. We actually have a lot of subtopics and interdependencies from them, so I want to discuss them now, and I will start with the synthesis aspect and then go over to the analysis aspect. So on the synthesis aspect, we had the 4 fun factor model of Lazzaros, which I included. So We start here with the aspect of hard fun. Just to recapitulate, hard fun was the aspect that I have situations which are very hard, frustrating, and then I manage them, and then I have the aspect of fiero and pride. And this is very often combined then with a relaxation period afterwards. So how they are related with each other. So if I put in hard fun in the terms of a pacing curve, so where I have a sequence of tasks that get to a certain degree more and more difficult. So this means that hard fun here puts a requirement on the game objective so that I can basically for different missions or sub problems generate different game objectives of increasing complexity. So basically here I have the feedback that I eventually need to modify my game objective to accommodate for hard fun. Hard fun usually also has an impact on the model. If I go for hard fun, usually the requirement on the model is for a certain degree of simplicity. So simplicity is not to be confused with triviality. So let's say, for instance, a game which is from the board game Go. Go is concerning its model and game rules a very simple game. So there are very few rules that govern on how to place your stone, but arguably it is one of the most complex board games that humankind has invented. So yeah, here you have to pay attention. Making a model more simple doesn't mean that you make your game trivial or too easy to play or nothing to learn about or whatever. It is just like the hard fun very often follows the scheme of simple to pick up, difficult to master. So this means simple to pick up usually means that, well, the basic rules of your model should be simple, but they allow for combinations that make it very difficult. So, I mean, a first-person shooter in the end, so like an action game, which is a typical case of hard fun, also follows this rule. So it's basically you have NPCs running around or players running around and you have to shoot them, period, nothing more. But of course this then becomes very, very complicated and difficult in the specific case. Also for hard fun, as I said, is you have the parts of excitement and relaxation. So you have those pacing curves, and of course this must be kind of reflected in your simulation, so that you provide options to show also the lower stress part. So let's say, for instance, I will go back to Holobrand here. In that case, it is like for hard fun, it is definitely has a hard fun aspects in there because it's a very competitive game. But in this case, as I said, it's like we introduce concepts like I want to be able to only place one product, 3 products, I want to create and destroy products and so on. So I have an increasing curve of difficulty in here. And this increasing curve of difficulty, of course, must also be reflected in the game objectives. And actually, that was kind of also fed back to the learning objective, where I said, okay, let's divide the learning objective into several parts. And they can then be reflected in the game objective to essentially accommodate for hard fun. On the plus side, here is also the Urbans model. If you write down the math formulas, and the concept is not that difficult. Difficult in its basic formulation. Of course, it gets difficult in practice then if you have several customers and several clusters of customers and several competitors and so on. But at its very core, it is relatively simple. So that was also one requirement. And for the simulation, as I said, is kind of I interleave the game. So the experiential learning with textbook learning. And of course, I needed to accommodate the textbook learning aspects also by being able to show in VR PowerPoint slides. So something very simple like that. But that is then also a requirement into the simulation core to be able to accommodate here for the relaxation phases, and also to have here the option to reflect the pacing curve directly. The next aspect then is easy fun. So as explained, easy fun is about basically the explorational aspects of games. So it's about you're wandering around and taking a look at things and find this wonderful. And easy fun also relates very much to a learning objective. And there's also a point where you have to pay attention. Because easy fun and exploration means that in the end you add some kind of details to your environment, so that goes into the model, but these details, they eventually may be distractive. So you have to pay attention there about adding potentially distractive information. So this may contradict or may support your learning objective. So if part of your learning objective is to distinguish important or unimportant information or to extract information from the situation, then it is supportive. And if it is not, it may be not supportive. So in this case, I would be cautious about providing easy fun at this case. So to go back to Holobrand, in Holobrand it worked. So in Holobrand I can create, or we created easy fun by having different three-dimensional visualizations of relatively complex market structures. And in this case it works because part of the learning objective is to adjust to different market conditions. So in this case it is supported. Yeah, but as I said, you have to pay attention here. But if it is supportive, and if part of your learning objective is really explicitly also to adjust yourself to more exotic situations and or to distinguish in the situation between important and unimportant information, then easy fun can be a very supportive element towards an educational game. So the next aspect is the aspect of serious fun. So serious fun is of course the point where theoretically your game should shine towards non-serious games. And because serious fun is about breaking the magic circle, so the question, what can you take out of the game to have something of value with you that you can carry on after you left the game. So the most simplistic form, which is very often used in serious games, but also in non-serious games, is, or better are, badges and high scores and whatever. So they are very popular, and of course they are very much related to the subject matter of game objective. So what you should achieve in that game, and if you have achieved something, then you get your achievement badge and whatever you want. On the other hand, you have the relation between serious fun and learning objective. So this means that if you do it right, then the player of the game also knows, well, I have learned something in the game here that I can apply in reality. So I have something that doesn't even depend on the evaluation of the game, because the game evaluates if it gives me badges. But I have something that is something totally of my own, that doesn't belong to the game or the game developer. That is the knowledge I gain out of the game and that I can apply in reality. Which I personally find far more satisfying. But of course, this only works when you have a direct relation between learning objective and game objective and learning objective and model. So as I said, if you do something like originally what I've explained in the math game, so where I say, well, you do a first-person shooter, and in order to collect more ammunition or weapons, you have to open crates, and you open the crates by unlocking using math problems. So that is something where learning objective and game objective are at least only very vaguely related. So in this case, I mean, primarily you are playing a first-person shooter with the objective to reach the end of the level, to kill as many enemies as possible or whatever, but nothing related to math. So in this case, you only have the option left of badges, but in this case, I primarily view it as an attempt to patch an inherently broken system. So don't do this, or to go back at the very beginning, try to get your brain and spine system right before you go into any of the other subjects here, and eventually try to cover up broken effects in the initial decisions you did. So, of course, once you got the core right and you have the aspect of serious fun and learning objective getting done right, so that you carry out the information, well, I've really learned something here that I can also apply in reality, which does not depend on the evaluation of the game. So even if the game evaluates me poorly or whatever, I have something that I can take out of this, no matter what the game or the developer of the game thinks about me. That's great, but additionally on that, of course, that doesn't prevent you to put on badges additionally. Okay, so the last aspect and the synthesis part and the last factor of the 4 fun factor model is people fun. Yeah, as I said, originally there are not that many serious educational games that contain people fun. But that's a subject matter I'm very much interested in, as I did in Holobrand and also did in another game that is not mentioned here yet for computer science subject and also for upcoming subjects. And but I think it's a part where there can still be a lot be exploited from a computer game point of view. I mean, in non-computer games, it is very much common. So if you think about wargaming, there, of course, the social aspect plays a very large role. Okay, so how is people fun related to all the other subjects? So that's starting a bit more complicated here. So first of all, the question is, should you include people fun? So this only makes sense if your learning objective contains some social aspects. So for Holobrand, for instance, it makes sense. Why? Because it says it's about how to place products on the market. So you want to place products on the market, and of course there are competitors on the market, and those competitors in the end are other humans. So in this case, it may make sense to include social aspects and therefore also introduce people fun. But when you say, I want to make a serious game about, I don't know, repairing a windmill. So if you repair a windmill usually on your own, so unless you have 2 workers on the windmill repairing them on the same time, there is in this learning objective to be able to repair a windmill no social aspects whatsoever involved. So going for people fun doesn't make any sense here. So, but people fun outgoing has a lot of relations in terms of requirements. So first of all is like, if I want to introduce people fun in my game, I will have requirements on my game objectives. So that's an aspect I discussed on the very first slides when I discussed game objectives and distinguished between single player and multiplayer aspects. So of course, if I want to introduce multiplayer here, then I have to think about, do I do solo missions as introductory, and do I do an adversarial game with adversarial game objectives, or a cooperative game with cooperative game objectives, or collaborative with collaborative ones. And then, of course, I have requirements to the model, because the model has to accommodate for actors which are player geared. So that means I have to pay attention that there are several actors that may interact with my model, and the model has to accommodate for n different players. And of course, the simulation is also important here because my engine must be multiplayer capable and usually also must be network capable if they are not playing on the same machine, which is also, for instance, the case in HoloBrand. So I used several HoloLenses here that are synchronized over a server. So there is also the question of networking involved here at that point. So PeopleFun has a lot of interactions with all the other different subcomponents here of meaning and reality. Okay, let's go to the analytical part of the aspects of play. So these are basically items from the PENS scale. So the first point is competence. So competence basically describes the sense of a player of how much do I feel that I get the situation under control and how much do I feel that I get competent at mastering the situation that is described in the learning objective. So there are references here towards game objective and model. So the requirement of competence puts a requirement on the game objective that the game has to provide simple and clear objectives. So I need to be able to, while I play the game, to be all the time absolutely sure about whether I'm getting closer to my goal or not. So as I said, as an example, what was kind of difficult was kind of for an airport scenario, the calculation of a final score that goes over 2 pages. That is kind of not so good. So if you think about also very complex games like Go is about, try to get the largest area of the board as possible. And so good games here referring to competence have very simple and clear objectives. And there's also reference to the model, because the second type of requirement I have to gain competence is that I get an immediate deterministic reaction from my environment where I act, so that I always know and I'm absolutely sure about what are the consequences of my actions that I just executed. So as I said, as an example now from traditional games, so if you think about a shooter and you're firing a rocket launcher or something like this, then it takes some time for the rocket to fly over and to explode. But what it is important here that when you fire the rocket, that you have a big rocket flare so that you immediately see, wow, I just fired something big here. So that's important. Going back to my example of HoloBrand, what I did here is to appeal to competence is to say, okay, I want to have a clear objective here is maximizing profit. And of course, what I did here in the model is that I included a display, what is my current profit? So that I see whatever I do in the game, it has an immediate impact on my profit. So that's probably, it's one of the most important aspects here. That you get the sense of competence right. The second analytical part was autonomy. As I said in the introduction, the idea of autonomy is that I as a player can do whatever I would like to do, so that I'm free in my choices. But as I said in the introduction, what I think is what is important is not autonomy per se, but the illusion of autonomy. Because if you think about it, what we just said about competence, that for competence you want to have simple and clear objectives, that kind of contradicts the aspects of autonomy, Because if you think naively about it, if I want to be autonomous, I would like to have as vaguely objectives as possible so that I can do whatever I want. And of course, there's kind of a contradiction. So if you take a look at games and what it is really done, and if you also take a look at reality, is, as I said when I discussed autonomy at the first point, is most people really overestimate the autonomy they have, and especially games are very good at fooling people into having more autonomy than they actually have. But that's not kind of an unethical thing or whatever, because people actually want to be fooled. So that's why I said, no, don't influence your game objectives by the idea of having autonomy primarily. So that is, autonomy itself is an illusion. So you want to support the illusion of autonomy. And supporting the illusion of autonomy can be done by influencing the model and the simulation. So you can get the sense of autonomy in the model by providing convexity. So that means that your model contains certain entry points, and from there you can do several things what you can do from that entry point, but they converge back towards one destination. So that's kind of the classical example in traditional games what you have with levels or missions. So you can kind of do different things in the mission, but in the end they wind up at the same point. So it's like, for instance, also for Holobrand, it's like you have different scenarios. You can act in those different scenarios differently, but actually those scenarios have very few Nash equilibria where you will probably wind up in one of them. So it's like, yeah, along the way you may have different micro decisions, but in the end you wind up at a certain destination. The other aspect of autonomy is to give you the illusion of freedom to make the world around you look larger than they actually is. So that is what you see in real games very often done is like, think about an indoor first-person shooter, for instance, but you have windows where you can look out and see something out there. Or what is also very often done if you have a very linear shooter, where you walk around a street, and then if you go into the side street, then the side street is blocked because of a burning barricade or whatever. So in the end, only a very small street is modeled, but the world looks larger, but you cannot just reach it. But you just have the illusion that there is more to be done. So that's the aspect of autonomy here. So for personally, what I see is autonomy is important, but always keep on mind what is really important is the illusion of freedom. So not so much freedom in itself. So aspect number 3 of the span scale was the question of immersion. So immersion is the question of how much do you get drawn into the world /simulation/game. And here I said it's like, because we are reflecting on reality and want to construct a world, then the question is how much does the world relate towards our learning objectives. Of course, it should kind of relate to, or it should relate to, not kind of, it should relate to, but it doesn't mean that it has to reflect the world on a superficial level, but it mostly has to reflect the world on what is relevant for the learning objective. So that's the question of validity versus fidelity. So that's the aspect what I said is about what I did in liquid marks, that I represented money with liquids and that you were standing at the chemistry table and so on. Of course, chemistry table and room and liquids has absolutely nothing to do with the Karl Marx theory on a superficial level. But here it was mostly about conveying the idea that, Marx theory is about mixing capital and having a very mechanistic image of our world. And so this means in terms of validity, using a machine where you mix waters is valid at this point, but it is not. It doesn't have a very high fidelity. And of course, the immersion then requires also a lot of technical aspects for the simulation. So what do I want to present? So let's say, for instance, in the case of liquid marks, I kind of needed to simulate fluids in a glass to be able to pour fluids in somewhere else. So I didn't need something like a smooth particle hydrodynamic simulator or whatever, but I kind of need to contain kind of the aspects of liquids, that it is volume conserving if I pour it, and that it gets oriented by gravity and so on. So these are technical aspects then if I want to get an immersion that go into the simulation. Yeah, the next and last analytical aspects of play is the subject of relatedness. So relatedness describes how do you relate to players, NPCs, things, locations in your game. So you see that kind of corresponds to what we saw in People Fun and the synthetic part. The difference here is in relatedness, that of course it is also about relating to other human players, but it is also about relating to NPCs if you have NPCs, or to things or objects in your game. So of course with the multiplayer part is then learning objective is again, if you can relate to other human players, is the question is, are there social aspects involved? So if you have multiplayer, yes or no. Then is relatedness is influenced by the gaming objective. So if it is multiplayer, then of course it may have multiplayer gaming objectives in there, but otherwise if you want to do something or achieve something, so that was kind of always the question of how do you act in a certain environment or certain situations, then the question is, do you act in a certain environment? So what is this environment? Can you relate to this environment? And does the action you execute involve some kind of tool or helps things like tools or whatever? And if so, then how can you relate to them? So that would be then the question, let's say, for instance, in liquid marks, where you relate to the glasses and the water that you constantly manipulate. So if you want to relate to them or relate to NPCs or players, or if it is an NPC or if it is an object, then of course the relatedness also puts on requirements on the model, because this means to be related towards that object, you need to be really able to do something powerful with it and to manipulate the world. And so that has to be reflected in the model. And of course, this also has to be reflected in the engine capability, maybe in the interaction, like I said, with the water glasses, that I need to simulate the water, or especially if you have a multiplayer game, that you need to have multiplayer and probably also network capability in your engine. So these are the relations of relatedness. Yeah, so I'm done here with the high-level perspective, or my specific high-level perspective on serious games. And starting from the Hartevelds Triadic Game Design model, reality, meaning, and play. Then going into more details, like I said, learning objective, game objective, model and simulation, and play part, synthesis and analysis part, and there even more specifically some points. And most importantly, describing the relations between those points, and also, of course, at this point mentioning what was my original intention, the communication problems that may easily arrive with domain experts / clients when designing serious games. Okay, now so I arrived at the end of my talk. Obviously I've stick towards it. Probably it lasted a lot longer now than I originally intended. So I hope you can take something out of it and enjoyed it. So it was about serious games for learning, and it was about mostly the more specific form of decomposing reality, meaning, and play and into sub-aspects and showing all the interdependencies. Of course, as I said, it is my personal view on that subject matter, which is basically stitched together by samples or aspects I read, and of course my personal experience I had while doing those games. So if you have different opinions on those or different ideas, I would be happy for a discussion in the comment section below where this video is posted. Otherwise, especially if you're interested in co-located multiplayer series games, then I would be happy to get into a discussion with you. Then you can also use the email address that I have just painted here in that video. Okay, that was it. Thank you for your attention.